We go get live.
Yeah, they'll get it right. And if they mess it up.
Whew. I am tired. It was a long night for me. The Lions played last
Yes.
night. One and
Yeah.
sound infection.
I have to shut something down. Potentially ask them about the activity report by location and see where it's being utilized.
Okay,
did you do that? Okay, so here's the schools. Well, he did exactly what I was just going to suggest. It says, but that's just 1:30.
Oh, that's not gonna be long. The only long thing is gonna be the policy discussion.
And everything the parent says is they can do.
I think that's the domain that
I'll
we
leave
leave
early.
early, the open internet, AI,
Yes.
and all that kind of stuff.
Also, it's flooding a little bit downtown. So they didn't see what they. Now you good?
I'm good.
All right, cool. Let's go ahead and call this meeting to order. Excuse me. It is November 11th. This is the Audit and Finance meeting for November 11th. And let's go ahead and call for an adoption of the agenda.
So moved.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
The ayes have it. We will now move forward to the approval of the minutes from the October 1st Audit and Finance meeting and the October 11th special call meeting. This is our first one from November. Do we have a motion to approve the minutes? We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a motion, a second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. The ayes have it. We will now move to 2A, the policy review for the policy review for DA, DB, DC, DD, DFAC, DFG, DFL, DFLR, which was a admin rule, but then also DID, DIE, and policy EI. We asked for this to be to come back to the Audit and Finance Committee because this did these new policies that were being asked to be approved by the board had a lot of financial implications for it. So we just wanted the Audit and Finance Committee to have some type of say for recommending this back to the board. All right. Do we?
All right.
We just start.
So yes, sir. And this went before Committee of the Whole. Committee of the Whole recommended first reading subject to the Audit and Finance Committee's recommendation. It actually did not go to the board in the October meeting. And so this would actually go straight to the board, assuming a favorable recommendation from Audit and Finance in November, but wouldn't go for second reading until December. So still 2 steps ahead of us with the work to do here, but everything that was presented to the Committee of the Whole with the changes recommended by the Committee of the Whole has been uploaded into board docs for your ability to view today. So I'll just walk through those policy by policy and happy to pause and take any questions. The first one is policy DA, which is fiscal management goals and priority objectives. And just kind of as a blanket statement, a lot of our work in updating these policies was to try to align with GFOA, GAAP, GASB, best practices for public entities in terms of financial reporting and policy guidance. So some of these things were co-opted from other organizations and best practice guidance from those organizations. So with this fiscal management goals and priority objectives, really what we're doing is just stating what's already in place in the sense that the CFO is responsible for maintaining the accounting system in compliance with generally accepted accounting principles, which is GAAP, and the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, which is GASB, with the objective of obtaining an unqualified opinion from the district's independent auditor, which is the highest opinion that can be given in that sense on the annual audit. And then just going further and talking about some of the best practices in maintaining our financial system, as well as maintaining internal controls. And it also talks about the notion that we give a monthly report to the Board of Trustees on our major funds, which is something that we're currently doing, but it was never codified in policy. So we just wanted to add that in there. So that is everything for policy DA.
Any questions on DA? Hearing none, let's move on to the next one, which will be DB.
Sarah, so DB is budget. And in this particular policy, we're also adding some items that are in alignment with what's currently happening, one of which is the budget calendar. So we currently, and as on this agenda, I believe, in an information item, we have the FY26 budget milestones calendar, but it calls for the CFO to prepare a calendar outlining the major deadlines and meetings necessary to adopt the budget. Also procedures and forms of development for the proposed budget, and the notion of the budget being presented initially in May for first reading, by second reading by June 30th of each year, prior to any expenditures being made. It also sets forth a process which we've previously undertaken. I think the last time it was done was in 2019, to formally increase appropriations or to execute supplemental appropriations if there's a major material change to the budget throughout the year. Traditionally, that would go through the board for approval for the supplemental appropriations, and this just documents how that process would work. So if there was an increase, for example, in revenues, or a decrease in revenues based on projections, or some need to make a substantial change to the budget from an expenditure standpoint, this just outlines the process in which it would be brought to the board for consideration, and notes that it requires board approval for those changes to happen. So those are the two major changes in DB for budget.
All right, any questions on DB? No. All right, cool, let's move forward.
Next is DC, which is taxing, borrowing, and debt management. Previously, it was just taxing and borrowing. So this policy adds in, the best way to say this is we currently have a policy on file with Emma, which is the organization where we make our filings associated with bonds that we have outstanding on a regular basis. Instead of that being a sidecar policy, we wanted to bring those items back in as a board adopted policy. So it talks about requirements for disclosure in terms of things that we have to provide on an ongoing basis after bonds are issued. These are all predetermined things. It's not something that we can go through and adjust. It's what's required by the entities that control or govern the oversight of bonds that have been issued by public entities. And so we talk about all the event notice requirements that are governed by the SEC, how the Emma organization that I mentioned, and the Digital Assurance Certification, or DAC, are involved in that process. And so all of this is just what we're currently doing, but formally outlines the requirements. And then there's a bulleted list that you'll see that talks about event notice requirements. And there's some 14 items that we have to note on a monthly basis, whether or not they have or not happened. And so there's something I have to fill out each month to say whether or not those things have happened, whether it's a delinquency in paying principal and interest, a draw on debt service that wasn't scheduled, a defeasance of bonds, a rating change from the rating agencies. So all of those things are currently in that sidecar policy that I mentioned, and we just wanted to roll that in to a board adopted policy. It also establishes a disclosure working group, which would be generally consistent with staff in my office, the CFO and the executive director of financial services, to ensure that there's a proper group of responsibility for ensuring that those things happen.
Any questions? Quick question. So you said this was merged from the Emma policy. So is that the Emma policy, the sidecar policy?
It'll stay. So if you go on the Emma website, we have to have something on file for our entity. And so that was just essentially their boilerplate that follows SEC requirements. And so we're just taking all of that and moving it in to the board adopted policy, because that actually, ensures that staff is following a board process, but also following a process that's established by kind of third-party policy.
So it checks two boxes at one time.
Yep.
Cool. Any further questions? All right, let's move forward to DD.
DD is grant proposals. So this previously was a very short policy, and what we're adding is really just kind of the internal process that would need to be considered for grants. As part of the FY25 budget, the grants office moved from learning services over to financial services. And so what we want to do is we put together a group right out the gate of staff from the academic side of the house, the financial side of the house, to vet grant opportunities and to ensure that learning services is advising us well on the availability of grants and what may be impactful to them in a positive way, and that we're also advising learning services and other groups throughout the organization of the implications of grants, such as holdover requirements for positions after the grant expires that we would have to pick up in our GOF, or matching costs that we may or may not have budgeted. So what this does is just sets forth several items that we are asking everyone to consider by policy when considering a grant proposal. Essentially grants should help us sustain our operations or expand our operations without reliance on local tax dollars, ensure that there's coordination amongst all departments within the system, make sure that we have the proper technical guidance and assistance with submission to ensure favorable outcomes and award, and then all of the monitoring requirements. We've also added a bullet here that would require a grant concept form. So when somebody wants to submit a grant, they would list all of these high-level items like, is there a matching requirement? Is there a supplant requirement for staff after the grant expires? What's the prospective amount of the award? And so all of that would essentially go on a cover sheet, and then it would go through a routing process for approval to make sure that each person in the process has a say before we submit that application. So we also listed here, and this would be more of a rule, administrative rule type thing, that there's a grant procedures document, and that's something that staff has created, which also includes that working group that I mentioned with 6 or 7 people throughout the system that come together and evaluate these opportunities.
Any questions? All right, quick. So you said that last part that you said again about the working groups?
So the grant procedures document
Gotcha.
would just be our internal set of kind of flexible procedures, and it also puts together who is a membership on that grant working group, just so that we have, as the organization grows and evolves, the right people at the table.
Right. So because obviously this will flow all the way down to the teachers. So let's say if a teacher wanted to submit a grant, then they will have ready with that procedure document ready for them to say, all right, I want to submit this grant. This is what I need to talk to first, like services first. Do I need to talk to financial services first? And they'll be able to flow through the process seamlessly, correct?
So, right. And the way we're going to manage it, which is kind of how it's always been done, is people will email, there's a grants@charleston.k12.sc.us email address.
Mm-hmm.
That goes through to financial services for initial intake, and we make sure we get all the right information. And then that group meets on at least a monthly basis to talk about opportunities and consider things. And if there's a timing issue, I think we had something that came through in the last week where, there was a deadline and it was a small grant, and they just, there's no risk, there's no matching requirement. We're going to go ahead and push that through without having further conversation. But that just makes sure that there's guardrails and thoughtful participants in the process. Largely when it was in learning services, the issue was more so us having budgetary concerns with matching requirements and not knowing what may come about from a grant that was awarded, and then getting caught during the budget process saying, oh, we didn't realize we needed to pick up this position or cost that was coming off of a grant that was ending. And so, now that it's moved over, we wanted to make sure that those folks still had a seat at the table.
Mm-hmm. And this is just for grants, not for like real property donations or anything. This
Just,
is
just for competitive grants. And so this wouldn't include any of like your, guaranteed award type situations. All of our, federal funds, of course, run through federal programs, and all of the accounting and fiscal management of those funds that are guaranteed awards run through the budget office.
All right. Any further questions? All right. Let's go ahead and move to DFAC.
All right. DFAC is fund balance. So there's one change between our initial recommendation to this recommendation today based on the committee of the whole conversation. The two major adjustments, one is creating an emergency reserve fund, and the other is formally adopting the weighted student funding fund balance policy that was pushed through as a technical recommendation during the budget process. So the emergency reserve fund, right now when we have a disaster, whether it be a FEMA declared disaster or some other material event that impacts the system via major insurance claim or something like that, all of our expenses come out of the GOF or the other, primary funding source, and that can cause, budgetary concerns with, things that weren't necessarily planned for on the general ledger. So what we are aspiring to do here is to create an emergency reserve fund, which would be an assigned portion of our general fund unassigned fund balance that would be set aside to cover the cost of deductibles and other claim costs before we get FEMA reimbursement to keep the general fund and our other funds protected. And so by doing this, we would move $1.5 million from our unassigned fund balance into this assignment for emergency reserves. And then each year, if we have a positive variance of revenue over expenditures, we would continue to grow that until it reaches 1% of the subsequent year's revenues. So right now, that would be $8.4 million of an $847 million general fund. And that's generally sized based on what our, risk of loss could be in a catastrophic event. If we had a significant building impairment and had to pay 2% on the value of the building, for example, in a deductible, or if we had, a major loss due to, a whole parking lot of vehicles gets flooded, and we didn't want to have to impact that department's budget. That funding would be set aside. And then whenever the FEMA reimbursements come back in, instead of having to figure out where all those dollars came from in a subsequent fiscal year, the dollars would just go back into that assigned fund balance for emergency reserves. On the WSF side of it, this is exactly what was described in the technical guidance. And so the WSF fund is a much smaller fund from the general fund. Of course, this year it's about $32.8 million. And so we're requiring by the policy a minimum of 10% fund balance. So roughly $3.2 million this year, just to provide for cash flows and flexibility for variances in the budget. But a cap of 40%. So if each year we had revenues over expenditures in WSF that accumulated a fund balance, once that fund balance hit 40%, then those funds would start going back to the GOF unassigned fund balance, because we wouldn't want to carry an excessive fund balance as a result of no policy being in place. It also allows for essentially a method to cure a school that overran their allocation of WSF in one particular year. And it could be deducted from their subsequent year allocation. But then it also kind of has this risk and reward component where schools that, don't overspend and have some savings at the end of the year, whatever the aggregated savings is, let's say that there's $1 million left on the table at the end of the year, the schools that were good stewards and had all their line items in the, positive variance at the end of the year, or at zero, would get to share 10% of the savings as a bonus in the subsequent year. And so just trying to find a way, not only to hold them accountable, but to incentivize them to be good stewards of the WSF, and they could use that funding for special programs within the WSF guardrails to plus up their programming going on. So those are the two major changes.
All right. Any questions?
Yeah, just make sure I follow.
We get give them a microphone so they can hear.
Sorry.
Thank you. There you go.
Just to follow, the target is 1% of the subsequent year. So how does that work if you don't, if something were to happen this year, we don't have a target yet. We don't have a budget yet for next year.
So it would reset at the point at which the budget is adopted by the board. So we would use the current available. So it'd be 8.4, this year. And then once next year's budget's approved, the goal would increase to whatever the next year's budget would be.
But how would you set it today? We don't have one for next year. So what is the target? Is it target right now, current year until the subsequent years?
Yes. So it would be the goal would be 8.4 million. So given the process, our audit's completed in December. And so we're typically in January, February timeframe making, transfers to meet fund balance policy requirements at that point in time. And so once we had our revenue projections and everything finalized going into that next budget cycle, based on the subsequent year's revenue from the prior year's final results. So, for example, let's say that at the end of FY25, our policy would be 8.4 million. We're starting with.
Sorry, just make sure.
Yeah.
Can you walk me through a fictional example? Let's say there was a significant storm, late season storm that happened now.
Mm-hmm.
And it caused something that would be, I don't know what that is, but let's say it's a $5 million incremental cost. Can you talk me through how that would work?
So if this was approved, or you're saying no policy in place, what would currently happen?
Well, getting to how with the policy in place, how it would work.
Okay. So, policies approved, there'd immediately be a $1.5 million assignment of our unassigned general fund balance that would become assigned for emergency reserves. And so if we had a catastrophic loss, then we would use those funds to cover any cost associated with deductibles or cost out of pocket for FEMA eligible items that were not covered by insurance. Of course, if it was in excess of the $1.5 million, it would start to come from our unassigned fund balance or hitting line items in the general fund budget, which is the problem we've faced historically. Because anytime we've had, a natural disaster, for example, and facilities has to go out and fortify schools, they're spending their current operating budget to fortify the schools. And then we're going on the back end and filing a FEMA claim and bringing those dollars in, 16 or 18 months later. And then the rest of the year, their budget is, messed up. And so this would give them an allocation available to work outside of the confines of their operating budget to get those things accomplished. And then the reimbursements would all just come back into the same place. And then at the end of the fiscal year, let's say that we had a $12 million positive variance of revenues over expenditures in the general fund, and that fund had the $1.5 million assigned in it, we would transfer the difference between the 1.5 and the policy requirement to meet that requirement for the emergency reserve before something else would then go to unassigned fund balance.
So again, I'm not an attorney, so maybe this language works, but it seems like setting a target based on a subsequent year that isn't yet approved, it seems like we can't actually calculate that number. So shouldn't it say something like based on the current year fund balance and updated at whatever the next year's fund balance is approved, or next year's budget is approved?
So let me look offline, but I'm fairly certain this is a GFOA language set, the Government Finance Officers Association. And I think that, just objectively to make sure that each year, there's kind of a prospective look at what the requirement is typically as budgets grow. So it's not, so it's not stagnating year in advance. But let me look, because I think it came from GFOA guiding language. And I want to make sure that we, kind of align closely with that. But I'll confirm that for you. And Jessica may be looking that up as we speak. She's over there looking it up, so we might have an answer rather quickly.
My question is for the WSF side, and it's really probably not on the policy side, but maybe on the administrative rule side. What happens for two things: the schools that use up all of their monies? Do we have administrative rules or guardrails for that? And I guess will their budget managers be following along to see the whys? And then on the other side, for the schools that did not use it and could possibly be hoarding, for lack of a better term, is there a rule for that?
Yes. So I'm going to take the second one first, because this does specifically address that there would not be carryover to try to ensure that the schools are spending the funds in the year that they're appropriated, so that they're not just accumulating this kind of rollover of additional funds. Really, they should be able to thoughtfully expend every dollar within the current fiscal period. On the first question, both the budget supervisors and the staff and financial operations that's overseeing the WSF program, they're looking at each school on a monthly basis and making sure, okay, you've got a encumbrance for salaries that's in excess of the budget that you have for this position. Before you go buy $5,000 worth of instructional materials, we need to make sure we transfer funds in to cover that difference. So there's very real-time process, and we can see that at the school level in whole, and we can also look at it in the line item detail for each individual allocation.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
All right, I'm just gonna jump off of that question. So basically back to your answer right there. So for this first year, because it's new for everyone, and for some schools, this is their first time getting a large lump sum in the way that we have it. So is it still use it or lose it for this first year? Or like this year be like just a test to say, all right, do better with trying to find the allocations, or what you're trying to do for next year?
I think that use it or lose it is probably the best way to start. If we get to the end of the year and we see a significant variance in unexpended funds, one thing that I'd like to consider from the budget process standpoint would be to use whatever positive variance we're projecting to help fund the subsequent year's program, to try to decrease some pressure on the transfer from the stuff. But of course, if we saw kind of untapped opportunity from year one of implementation where, hey, we just didn't have enough time to get this thing ramped up. Right. There could be some consideration there at a school by school level. Right. Fortunately, though, I don't think we're seeing that. The biggest thing is the education of the principals and making sure they understand how to use these resources, because we had a conversation last week about a school that had lost an allocation, for example, and they didn't realize that they had some unallocated WSF funds that they could use to help support keeping that position. And so we said, oh yeah, you've got X number of dollars that you could move over that's not currently been allocated. Submit the form, we'll move the money over, and then you only have to find an additional $20,000 to fund the cost of that position through the end of the year. So we're trying to keep an eye on areas where there might be unallocated dollars that have been budgeted that have not been tapped by the school, and very particularly put that in the transparency dashboard. And so you can look on that new dashboard on the website, and I'm just going to pull it up just to get an idea of what that number looks like. So of the $34.2 million set aside for WSF with all the hold harmless money for salaries from the $8,000 increase, 32.55 million of it has been allocated,
Okay.
meaning it's currently tied to a position or a program. So across the entire system, you're within $2 million, and we're, not even halfway through the year yet. So I think it's a good indicator at this point that, people are tapping that resource and not leaving too much on the table. But
Right.
we'll continue to track it.
Right. I was thinking like with everything coming online about May, June, July, we have teachers, principals are like, all right, we got to figure out how we're about to spend this money now. And, next year they can be more creative and think, all right, we know how much we have. And, I had this whole year. Now let me go ahead and hit the ground and start running with it. But yeah,
Well-
as long as there's the consideration for that.
And part of our master budget calendar too, which it's not in the full detail of what I'll share later on in the meeting, but we've included a WSF kind of timeline within the master budget process so that we can come up with the FY26 allocations early and give schools an idea of what they can expect so that they can start that programming earlier this year as well. I think that really kind of went full force in March for FY25. And once we get through, this month really with having 45-day numbers in the system, we can start to put those projections together with a goal to get those to schools in January.
And I'm glad we got the language in there up at the top now for, what was that, B? I think it was. No, excuse me.
I need to get back over to the item.
Yeah, B, we actually define what an emergency is and how we actually define emergency, because that was one of the biggest things that we have coming from Kyle. But my next question will actually rise back to what some of you were talking about earlier. So we're going to make the initial transfer of 1.5. And then we're going to work towards pulling that 8.4 over, or are we just going to pull the 8.4 over also?
Work towards it. So if we had a positive variance, as I was saying to Mr. Griffin at the end of the year, that allowed us to move funds into there, then we would continue to chip away at meeting that goal until it was met, but would always maintain a minimum of 1.5.
So 1.5 is the minimum.
Minimum.
All right. Cool.
And you're right. In 2B, that highlighted term is the area that was clarified from Cal, where an emergency is defined. That would be a significant catastrophic loss requiring a material insurance claim or a federally declared disaster. So that presidential disaster declaration would then trigger the use of the fund if it wasn't a material insurance claim from something that happened outside of a federal disaster.
And the initial 1.5 is coming from where again?
So just our unassigned fund balance.
Okay.
So it wouldn't even actually be a transfer. It's just a classification process. And so we would classify $1.5 million as assigned for emergency reserves, and then the rest of it's currently classified as unassigned. And so that stays within our policy framework of having the 2 months or the 8.3% requirement maintained by the state.
Okay, that's what I was wondering,
Yep.
whether it's going to come off of that, and then we would have to refigure our fund balance and say, all right, we're going low or anything. So yeah, as long as it's still within the fund balance.
Absolutely.
Yep. All right, perfect. Let's go ahead and move forward to DFG.
All right.
Second.
DFG is tuition income, very simple, just added a line that tuition being collected from non-resident students must otherwise be qualified to enroll in the Charleston County School District. So that we've seen some of those circumstances come about, particularly when we were making adjustments to policy. I think it was the J volume back a couple of months ago. And so this was just an area that we had flagged to update when we got into the D policies.
Any questions? All right, DFL.
Excuse me. DFL is investment earnings. So this just delegates authority for investments to the CFO through the superintendent and oversight of the administration, management, investment of the district's funds, and indicates that it could be managed through multiple portfolios to preserve capital, but of course, while maintaining liquidity to support operations and obtaining the best rate of return. The majority of this is captured in DFLR, which is the administrative rule.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll jump into that as well, if that's okay. So what we put together here is an investment policy statement and procedures, just to ensure that we're being thoughtful in consideration of the code of laws when investing public dollars. Realistically, right now, our investments are predominantly in the South Carolina Secretary of State, South Carolina State Treasurer's local government investment pool. The interest rate environment recently has been favorable to the funds being invested there. And that's one-day liquid. We can call those funds at any time, transfer them back into our Wells Fargo primary operating accounts, and use them for any district purpose. But as the market changes, there could be circumstances where we want to consider other strategies. to ensure that we're bringing in interest earnings that are impactful to the district. Just as an example, the local government investment pool in fiscal 24 brought in over $8 million in interest earnings to the GOF. I mean, it's real money. You're talking, the value of multiple mills of a tax levy. And so, interest can be very impactful to supporting our budget if done right, but, it's also volatile from the standpoint of, changes in the economy. So put together the policy statement and the procedures to make sure that, less or so here, but of course in my time in county government where you have an elected treasurer and a, staff level CFO, making sure that there's internal controls and assignment of responsibilities. But generally we want to make sure that we've properly structured investments, that they've been competitively procured in compliance with the systems procurement code, that they're legal. There's certain things under the South Carolina Code of Laws that local governments cannot invest in, different mutual funds and things like that. So making sure that that's clarified, and that they're safe and that liquidity is appropriate, that we don't go and create some type of ladder strategy that locks down funds for more than multiple years, and you need those funds to be able to make payroll in December and then have to issue a TAN as a result, which this just chips away at the whole point of why you had the funds invested in the first place. So making sure that proper cash flows and everything like that are completed to understand the impacts of the investment that's being contemplated, and the internal controls. So all of the investment portfolios, if there ever was anything, would be subject to the external audit review through our regular audit process.
Couple questions. So how is this, how is it different? How is it working today differently than what happened with this policy?
So really most of this is all in the administrative rule. We just wanted to document, and Jessica might tap me and tell me, I can't remember the exact source where we pulled some of this language from. Right now there's nothing. And so, we could go out there and say, we want to procure a financial advisor or, a investment firm to help us manage some cash in our sales tax, for example. And as long as it was legal, we could do it. But there's no guiding language that says it may be legal, but make sure that you're being mindful of liquidity requirements, because you've got certain payments that are going to come due at a certain point in time, and what have you. So currently we're just following the law, and so we just wanted to put something in that gave us some teeth locally to say you'll procure it using the code, that you can't just go out and hire any investment advisor and work with them to create a portfolio, and be mindful of the state law, because local governments can't go invest anything, and then make sure that the structure and the rates of return are appropriate in consideration of the other opportunities that are out there, like the state treasurer's office local government investment pool. Don't go lock all your money down in an investment that is earning less than what you would get to have one day liquid cash in the local government investment pool, depending on where the economy is.
So order of magnitude, what kind of dollars are we talking about? What kind of term do you have? Yeah, right.
So, it, of course, depends on the time of the year, but our operations account, can swell up to several $100 million at the high point throughout the year. And that predominantly sits in the local government investment pool. Right now, since we're issuing a TAN still to support cash flow, there's no situation where we would create any type of investment for, cash on hand for operations, because we need that cash to cycle through the course of the year. I think some of this may be more towards our, capital programs and some of the cash that we're bringing in, that we're not immediately expending from sales tax collections, for example, to try and bolster the offset of what we're spending on short-term borrowings to support that program, just to try to balance that out a little bit, but not really from an operating standpoint.
So I'm presuming most of these investments are in, well, I know you said through the state.
It's all local government investment pool
If you
now.
were to go outside the state, would they generally be sort of treasury type investments, or they locked, fixed income by investment grade, certain investment grade? I'm presuming U.S. government credits, or would you go further down the risk spectrum?
Could potentially look at slugs or something like that, depending on the circumstance. But predominantly treasury, top tier credit, within a 1-year term. Predominantly, if the local government investment pool was, in a situation where it was back in 2019, where it was bringing in 0.4%. And we had an opportunity to maybe look at trying to sustain some of our interest earnings in a more thoughtful way compared to, what we could do with what we're doing now.
Would they all be fixed income? Meaning, if you have so many investments that are for capital items that could be decade or could be many years out, would you be investing all in equities of any kind?
In terms of, I mean, I wouldn't see any multi-term, like any long-term investments based on what we're currently carrying. I mean, if we got to a point where, and I don't think from a strategy standpoint, we would get there from an operating perspective, but if we were carrying 30% fund balance in the GOF and we were bottoming out at the end of the year at, $35 million in cash, comfortably every year, and we wanted to look at investing some of that, to try to bring back, higher rate of return from, what we're seeing out of the investment pool. I could see something, potentially happening from that standpoint. But, even within, of course, the sales tax is capped statutorily at 7 years before it has to re-up. So you could never consider, too long-term anyways with those assets because of the nature of how it has to reset and become a new program.
And so what's the oversight that you would see over the staff? It seems like on a not-for-profit endowment or a corporate entity, you often have some other outside body providing some sort of oversight of that investment process. But it doesn't sound like there's just a specific external process
We got that.
reviewing our investment portfolio strategy.
Right now, there's not. No, I mean, right now it's pretty much, us looking on a monthly basis and moving cash back and forth between the investment pool into, Wells Fargo and ops based on cash flow needs. I could see potentially, going out for an RFP to bring in, some type of an investment advisor if we got into a situation where that was going to be impactful for us. And then, of course, in that circumstance, they would come through this committee and advise, on some recurring basis of what, structure they were looking at for, what dollars that we were looking to invest. But it's just, there's nothing right now that's happening. I just kind of, if we get into that realm of operations down the road, wanted there to be some structure from a staff administrative rule standpoint to, ensure we had something to sink our teeth into.
So might it make sense to report back to presumably this committee or board on some periodic basis what types of investments we're making, and then if it does seem like we're starting to get away from, I presume everything you're doing is going to be ultra secure and super low risk. I don't think there's much real practical risk, but from a fiduciary perspective, it seems like reporting back to show what we're investing in to basically prove that these are low risk investments. And then also to, if we do drift away from anything besides the state piece, to make sure that there's been some buy-in, above outside the staff for that concept.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give an example. In prior life, we had a very long-term sales tax program, and looking at carrying 10 years worth of collections for road projects that weren't going to happen until 7 or 8 years down the road. And how can we get some more bang for our buck on those dollars over the course of a long term? Procured an investment advisor, looked at a ladder strategy for how we might consider a diverse portfolio that would bring in better returns than we were seeing in the local government investment pool. And then complementary to that, had a local bank. When the when the local government investment pool was down 0.4% range, say I'll give you a letter of credit for 2.5%. If you'll give me $10 million over the course of the next 12 months. And so we, put out a letter of interest to see if there was any other institution locally that would match that. And, all right, that's going to bring in X number of dollars that we would have never received otherwise. But they also said, it's 1 day liquid. If you need to pull it, we're just asking kind of for, general pledge. But, if something like that came up and we went outside the norm of the, local government investment pool, we would bring that through the committee to advise on what we were doing and report out on the results of it.
The extremes would happen with a lot of municipalities and the pension funds and stuff.
Yeah.
Investing in things that were further down the spectrum than they probably understood. And I don't think I'm sure you're not anywhere close to that or will ever get there, but we should probably have a process that allows people to be able to prove to themselves that that's the case.
And the state code is very rigid on what local government can do. And so, when you say, hey, I'm public entity A coming to, look at X, Y, and Z, the lens that they're looking of opportunity is significantly reduced from what a, nonprofit or public or private entity might be doing, just, based on how statute controls a lot of that.
that's the case, which is why we shouldn't create any sort of committee or any sort of excess structure on it, but I think we just report it out.
Absolutely.
Now,
And we have in our audit right now, a general description of what our investments have yielded over the course of the year. So that would become a more extensive statement in our notes of the financial statements, assuming we had different, investments that were out there, just showing, what the rates of return were and what the programs and everything were. But we'd bring that through the committee before we did anything of that nature.
Took a couple of my questions. You got any questions? All right. So when we're going back to the advisors, that's going to be, if we do bring in a financial advisor to look at what we're looking at, that'll come through procedure 10 for the competitive procurement.
Say again?
If we were looking to bring in an advisor or financial advisor, would not that'll come through procedure 10 for the competitive procurement?
Yeah, we anything we did to bring in an investment advisor, we'd put out a request for proposals and evaluate on, qualitative, their qualifications, performance, all those kind of things in terms of working with other entities. We do have some value-added services through our Wells Fargo contract that we haven't tapped, and it's just really been by virtue of the local government investment pool and what it's been yielding, and the fact that our cash flows don't dictate something more creative right now. Just, wanted to put some structure to it if we ever saw the need.
Cool. And the audit under the internal control, that's the one that comes through this committee, correct? Yeah. When is that one coming up? Oh, I can't remember
Audit will
our
be
calendar.
presented at the December meeting.
December? All right, cool. All right. Any further questions?
Did I just dream this, or did you say at one point in time that with the structures that you're putting in place, not have to do TANs?
That's the goal.
Okay.
Yes. So that number is decreasing. The TAN that was just approved for 60 million, we only issued 30, or haven't issued it yet, but we're planning to issue 30 million of the 60 million. And the goal is to get to a point where we're not relying upon that last monthly transfer from the treasurer's office to support cash flows. That'll save us a few $100,000 a year in interest.
Are they still on track for December 14th?
That's the goal. And we will let you know how it pans out. But yeah, so we believe that if they make the payment this year, going into that second week of December, before the 15th, that will be okay. But I didn't want to try and run a December 15th payroll without a fail-safe in place, being so close to the wire. So that's why we're issuing what we are.
Cool. Let's go on and move towards DID.
Okay. So this is fixed assets. Just a few small changes here. It referenced depreciation GASB 34, which was a late 90s era Governmental Accounting Standards Board pronouncement. And so there's been various changes over the years. So we just took that header off and essentially said that we'll be maintaining our fixed asset system in conjunction with the requirements that are set forth by state and federal laws, et cetera, which is in line 2, which was already there. We do have a property management tracking system based on certain thresholds already. So we're just adding that language in there to codify what we're already doing. And then, of course, capital and fixed asset procedures are maintained by finance. And then the inventory and monitoring requirements for federal funds are maintained by federal programs.
Any questions on that? All right, let's move forward to DIE.
DIE is audits. So this is always required that the books of the district shall be audited by an independent financial advisor, or independent CPA, excuse me. And it previously assigned responsibility to the superintendent for filing copies of the audit with the proper authorities. The way that ultimately works is, we have to file with the State Department of Education, with Federal Audit Clearinghouse, various other entities that have their own regulations. And so we're just staying in accordance with state law and regulations. These records will be audited following the close of the fiscal year, that will contract with the CPA as required, and that the district as a whole will forward the required copies of the audited financial statements to the Department of Education and other state and federal agencies as requested or applicable. And so we know who they are when we need to file with them based on our own internal procedures. It's not just one audit being sent by the superintendent to one entity. It's a very multifaceted process.
Any questions? My only question, so when we look at forward with the board contracting for the independent certified public accountant, that audit, when we're looking at those type of audits, that will go off with the calendar that we have for this committee.
So the independent audit, when I think it's a 5-year contract, that would come through for approval at the 5th year. I think there's one more year left on that contract. And then the internal audit contract went through, an internal RFP, and that had executed and approved by the superintendent per policy for internal audits. That firm was just hired, and they're starting their first 2 audits, and those will come through this committee as those audits wrap up.
Right. So if we have 1 year left, I guess the board would need to know when it's time to start pushing that out. So I'm sure
This-
you know,
Over the next, between now and the summertime, we'd be putting that RFP out and bringing in firms to interview and then make a recommendation.
Thank you. Let's move towards the last one, EI.
All right, EI, very small change. Change the word personnel and staff members to consistently reference district employees, so that it's all the same definition. And then we struck a sentence regarding school bus drivers who are covered by the state and volunteers who are not employees being exceptions. We don't have that configuration in the same way anymore, and so it just wasn't applicable to the policy. So we cover with workers' comp those that we're required to, whether they're volunteers or employees of the district accordingly, but not our contractors that work for the bus system and all those kind of things.
Mhm. So basically taking the personnel out and putting in district employees, or take away the vagueness of, say, if it was like bud groups or something like that, because they can technically fall under personnel, even though we don't.
Their contract requires that their company carries their workers' comp, and they hold us harmless from that standpoint if there's an employee injury.
Any further questions? All right, thank you. We're gonna go ahead and move to 2B, and we'll come back to the action items after the public comments. Mr. Barowie.
Yes, sir. So this action is to take program contingency from FY24 and put it toward a new program. It's being laid out there to have the money go to furniture, fixtures, and equipment, but it's really to implement a program which has been, we're looking at changing here in the next few years. In the past, when schools needed tables and chairs for events, we rented those. We've been doing that since 2008. Last 16 years, the price has gone up 350% over the last 9 years. So the deputy superintendent, CFO, asked us to take a look at another option, and fixed cost of ownership is another way to source some of that by buying tables and chairs. So we did survey schools to find out how many they can use without having to go to a rental company and how many they could store on site. So we want to start with the schools that have storage capability and begin buying the tables and chairs for those schools. So this is step 1 of the process. We'll begin buying those tables and chairs. We'll probably look at coming to you with a FY25 reallocation, and we'll put money in the FY26 budget. But it is a very quick payback by owning our own compared to renting.
Cool. Any questions?
One last point is that we will still have large events that will have to go to
Right.
EventWorks. We're not out of the clear totally, but this will make a substantial improvement and support the schools.
Mhm. My only question when this popped up from before, have we decided what schools we are when they're having this first wave, and thinking about
Correct.
proximity of say if like a school needed it down in Hollywood, but everything's over in Wando or anything?
So we have 41 schools that have indicated they have storage capability. The numbers vary between those schools, so the final determination of where they'll go hasn't been made yet.
Mhm.
But we'll look to do exactly what you just said, to make sure they're distributed in a way that if a school nearby can gain access to those,
Mhm.
until we get them their tables and chairs, that's what we'll try to do.
Right.
Yes, sir,
right.
good point.
And do we already have the trucks available to be able to make that happen?
We have the trucks we're buying the carts for both the chairs and tables to make it easily movable between the schools. That transportation will have to be accommodated.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah. Long past due. Long past due. I have people renting my tables for me out the Avery at this point, but it's definitely needed. Thank you. So we're gonna move forward to 3A. Do we have any public comments? Cool. All right, we're gonna go ahead and move forward to 2A, which will be a recommendation to approve to recommend all of the policies that came forward to the board for first reader. Do we have a motion? We have a motion and a second. Do we have any further discussion on the policies? All right, hearing none. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All right, the ayes have it. Let's go to 2B, which would be the FCO for fiscal year 24. No, the budget reallocation for fiscal year 24. Do we have a motion to approve the reallocation of funds as shown on the attached resolution? We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
The ayes have it. Let's go ahead and move over to 5A, which would be the purchases and contracts greater than 250.
All right, so just one new competitive procurement this month. That was for the Baptist Hill Athletic Design Service Phase 1 and 2. This is open for 29 days. We had 16 bids. Hate to be on the selection committee that had to go through all of those proposals, but that was awarded to Stubbs Moore Joharan, funded by the Phase 5 sales tax. And then we had two existing procurement methods or other procurement methods, one of which was an exemption for iReady, and the other was for an existing contract with Coastal Bus Line for our supplemental home to school bus transportation for Patterson's Academy. We've also attached, which we'll get into later in the meeting, the P-card manual as a link, or excuse me, not the P-card, the P-card manual as a link to this document, and we'll update the final red item with the procurement procedures manual once that work is finished.
Great. Any questions? The Baptist Hill, that was for the track. The Baptist Hill, that was for the track.
Yes, sir. We should be getting prices in for the press box and
Yeah. Press
field
box.
house here in December.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. Thank you. Let's go ahead and move forward to the ESSER update.
So this is the ESSER report for the month ended 9/30, but not the final ESSER report, because we do still have a couple more months of claims to make. The last claim should be happening in the next week, so the November report's really the end of it. But as of this report, we had been reimbursed 161.1 million of the 163.2 million. And so once those September transactions and everything post, the claim is filed, we'll see the full reimbursement match the amount that was authorized. And we also made the journal entries necessary to move ESSER dollars to cover salaries for the first quarter of this fiscal year so that we could ensure that every dollar was expended. So just close to the finish line there.
Right. So we're looking at about February to be completely shut out.
So I would say the January report for November would show the final claim, so all reimbursements posted. And then, of course, we get into our audits and everything going through the end of the fiscal year. So we realistically could be talking about ESSER sometime late next summer, going into the end of it, since we did have a quarter of activity in this fiscal year.
I was thinking about April, but I can see the summer.
Mhm. All right. Any further questions? All right. Let's move on to 5C, the monthly financial reports.
Yes. So the financial report for the GOF, that'll be the first document. And then we have the WSF report for September. So not a lot of activity here, still in the first quarter of the fiscal year. We're seeing some positive variances in revenues thus far. And as I mentioned, we've seen our assessments come through from the county auditor's office, and we were within 1% of what we budgeted. So we're going to be very close on revenues this year based on those early numbers that we've seen based on billed assessments and our collection factor that we apply. And then expenditures are really running on budget thus far. As we start to get through the midpoint of the year, we'll have some better projections on salaries and benefits in particular, but everything is tracking, particularly based on the adjustments that we made this year for charter schools, insurance premiums, and some of those items that needed to be adjusted. So everything's looking good to date.
All right. Before you move to WSF, can you just give a little explanation about the revenues that were?
Sure.
Yeah.
So reflecting a $261,000 variance positive on the local sources, there's a lot of other line items rolled up in that. For example, local tuition payments that we don't budget because they're just small items, and some other local sources that vary year to year that we don't always budget. And so anything that's not budgeted that we collect is going to show up as a variance. And then once we start to get our tax collections posting, any anticipated variances over what we budgeted will also get included in that column as we get a little further through the year.
Cool. Thank you. Let's go to move to WSF.
And then WSF, of course, the link is in there for the dashboard. And then we have the PDF report. So as I mentioned earlier, if you go down to those last few pages, you can see Of the $34.2 million budgeted, 32.5 of it has been allocated. And through the end of the month, we had posted $6.3 million in expenditures for the year, with $27 million to go. So given that so much of this is allocated on salaries and the majority of these positions are full, we anticipate that those expenditures will track as we have projected. And I think communications is putting the dashboard up there as we've shown in the past, but that's now live on the website through October 15th. And then before the next meeting, we'll update it through November 15th and keep it fresh within 30 days. But users can click through that and look at each individual school's allocation and how much they've allocated, encumbered, and expended in the top banner that runs across the top of the page.
Any questions? Just one question for 0127, the district-wide accounting of 590,000. Even going through the dashboard, it's not nothing has been allocated of that 590 yet. But where's that going?
What was in 127 was the hold harmless money for the 8,000, and essentially the difference is what people hired in classified positions versus what they hired in certified positions. Because when we did the WSF budget, we already had the 100% of market included, but we had the certified raises in at 5,000 originally. So we included a $3,000 hold harmless plus benefits per certified position. And so if somebody ended up bringing in a classified position instead of a certified position, we had some extra left over. So of that $2 million difference between what was allocated and what was budgeted, that 590,000 additional hold harmless money that's available to cover salaries, as people bring in certified positions to cover that raise.
So it's a fail-safe basically at this point.
So, and that won't happen next year because the goal will be to program in the base salary at the beginning of WSF and not have to do a hold harmless at the end of the process like we did this year.
Thank you very much. Let's go ahead and move to my favorite report, the capital projects. Ms. Costello, what's up?
Thank you, Mr. Calhoun, and good afternoon, committee. I'd like to present the September capital projects report this afternoon. Our revenue collections, the most recent collections were $722,000 below our cash flow model projection. The expenditures for the month are as follows. For the 2010 through 2016 program, $18,000. For the 2017 through 22 program, $2.0 million. For the 2023 through 2028 program, $14.8 million. For the 2023 through 2028 program paid for with long-term debt is $2.6 million. Fixed cost of ownership 24 is wrapping up, and fixed cost fiscal year 25 is commenced and moving forward. And I'm happy to answer any questions anyone might have.
Any questions? I do have one question from Mr. Barowie. With the future of us getting upstairs with 75 Calhoun, how will this affect way forward emergency operations at Bridgeview?
So the move here to Calhoun won't affect the EOC at all.
Okay.
The EOC will stay exactly the way it is.
All right.
So there won't be any impact on the sales tax program from phase 4.
Okay. Perfect. That was my only question I had about that. Any further questions?
So I just had a question.
Use the mic so they can hear you online.
Are the, so we're at 722 grand below where we were projected?
Yes, for the
And that's
month.
just for 23 through 28?
Yes,
Okay,
yes. The prior programs, all the sales tax revenues have been collected.
okay, all right. And so, and maybe this is a Mr. Prentice question, do those, like the extra, however, it looked like maybe 42 million in the last program still sit, is that just sitting in the bank somewhere or?
So the unexpended from phase 4 you're talking about, so that's a separate segregated cash account. And so that's accruing interest, and those dollars are available to be reallocated through the conclusion of the program under the allowances in the referendum.
So is this still, is the 722 below, we're pretty early into that program. Is that a normal blip or is it look like we're gonna be way off for this 5 years? I know it's too early to tell, but.
The 23 through 28 revenues, they've been kind of up and down and constant, but within our 2% projection with the projected cash flow.
Okay,
So we still feel pretty good about that, along with our financial advisors.
okay.
There's a lot of seasonality with sales tax too. And so when you look at, what's posted year to date, sometimes those numbers can be a bit deceiving depending on how DOR remits. And, of course, the seasonality of when things are collected. It doesn't typically ride a consistent line throughout the year just based on the climate and economy that we exist in as well.
Thank you. Any further questions? All right, let's go to outcomes-based contracting pilot.
Yes. So just for some information, this is something that we've been discussing at the staff level regarding ways that we can be more efficient with public dollars and try to hold our vendors accountable for services that are delivered predominantly to students and into classrooms. And so there is a cohort that looks at outcomes-based contracting. I know Ms. Huggins talked to some of her peers and other organizations that are doing this outside of South Carolina. And so asked procurement staff to put together a pilot of sorts to look at ways that we could change how we put out requests for proposals for various services. And so what we've put together is an example that looks at high impact tutoring. And so right now, if we were to put out a request for proposal to bring in a firm to provide high impact tutoring, we might say, if you serve 200 students, we'll pay you $200,000, and that's it. And our accountability to that vendor would be both in determining their prior success and their qualifications to provide the service, and then whether or not they simply showed up and provided tutoring. What this would do is take it a step further and essentially assign an outcomes rate card to say, you're going to get a base payment for the number of students that you serve, which may be a component of that amount that we would have otherwise awarded in full. But if you see an outcome metric, for example, growth in math or proficiency in a specific area that hits a certain metric, you're going to get the following payments based on the success of your program. And so that number could be at the mid-range, what we would likely pay under the current scenario, at a low range, less than we would currently pay, and at a high range, more than we would currently pay, because the delivery of the service being effective would drive the investment that we would make. And so it would help us budget a little differently, but it would also help us hold vendors accountable and track. And so with WSF and some of these other things that are in place, this would give our schools an opportunity to also tie some procurement metrics to the services that they're delivering, whether it be at one single school or a service across the system. So nothing in particular has been determined for a next step in terms of what we might put out. But now we have a draft request for proposals and a draft rate card that we could consider using. We're looking to send possibly one member of procurement through like a cohort training to give them some exposure. And then we'll sit down with our staff and learning services and look throughout the system at next fiscal year at areas where we could consider targeting this for implementation and then tracking it to see if it's successful.
All right. Any questions?
I don't have a question, but a comment. This is long overdue.
Mm-hmm.
I think if we had this for ESSER, we would have seen a lot of different results. This is performance-based. It's not just showing up and we get no return on our investment. So this is really good, long overdue, and I look forward to getting some more information on it to see who send someone to get that training. It's performance-based contracting. Yeah.
And Ms. Huggins, you talked about this a couple of days ago, but can you talk a little bit about the qualitative versus the quantitative, basically the methods of us determining what is a positive outcome?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Calhoun, and Ms. Roberson, thank you for your keen interest in this. I do believe it's long overdue. It's the way businesses are run, and successful businesses, that is. And so Mr. Calhoun asked some really poignant questions when we did the agenda review about this. And so we'd be looking at both quantitative and qualitative measurements likely, but most linked to improved student growth on MAP and iReady and achievement on SC Ready and EOC scores. And so, as you know, given your work on audit finance and on the board for the last few years, we often enter into multi-year contracts. And there are some firms that really show up. They offer people on site in our schools offering support. That's where we typically yield the most student growth and improvement. And there are others that not so much. So there are ways we could measure student well-being if we were providing wraparound supports or programs that did such, but and that's a more qualitative measurement, but we certainly would look to quantify to the greatest extent that we can. So thank you for your interest and support, and we'll certainly keep the board updated. We're particularly looking at this as we focus on the WSF and trying to nail down by the start of the next calendar year the measures associated with evaluating the effectiveness of people and programs in the schools.
Thank you. And Mr. Prentice, this is only for contracts, not like bringing in consultants and everything, only like the school, not school-based, but the service contracts or whatnot?
It would really be for school-based services. It wouldn't be for something like rebidding a custodian contract. We're not looking to necessarily have a metric that says, how clean were the floor of the bathrooms on Tuesday type situation. That's a management type situation within operations and overseeing contracts. So it's not really intended to replace the staff involved, but it could be a non-academic service where we saw a performance outcome that was trackable. If it was of impact and we wanted to consider it, it could be on either side of the house.
May I offer something, Mr. Calhoun? We too believe that this is going to really attract and recruit the high quality vendors, those that are serious about outcomes and really serious about a partnership. So I'm excited to see where this metric will lead us and the data that we're able to gather that I think really could be a model not only for Charleston, but for the state.
We did this in Virginia. A lot of people don't like performance-based anything, but it worked. So I look forward to getting more information on this.
Right. And my last question, we wouldn't be like retroactively putting people into it. We couldn't. Would be illegal, right? We couldn't.
No, we couldn't, unless the vendor was bilaterally willing to amend a contract, where we said we'll offer this and they said we'll accept it, but we couldn't just say all of a sudden we're going to withhold payment because you didn't meet some metric. So everyone that would participate would do so willingly by submitting a proposal to an RFP that we put out there.
But everything going forward, it will be on this model. But that'd be something nice to like just dangle out there, like, hey, you could possibly be making more right now if you wanted to go to this, if you actually believe in your services right now.
And I think the timing of it will be good. The new procurement portal is supposed to launch the first week of December. And so it's out there, it's available now. It's just not been put to the website. And so I think we'll get a lot more exposure to our request for proposals. And so, by holding to a higher standard, we should get the quality that Dr. Clamp mentioned, both in volume and in who's coming to the table.
Yeah. Cool. Very good.
Thank you. Let's go ahead and move forward to 5F.
All right, this is the P card manual changes. So I included a memo just overviewing the changes as well as the new document. So a lot of this is in consideration of efficiency in serving schools and giving some clarity on how things are being administered. Of course, as I've mentioned previously, we are looking to migrate from our current platform with Bank of America to Wells Fargo. And so that does consider some of the ways that new system would work in a more modern fashion. But the high level changes, we included now a threshold. Right now across the entire system, you can't make a transaction greater than $2,500. That straps people in terms of booking travel, in terms of purchasing things that are small value items, of a high quantity that they want to purchase for a school, for example. They have to go and get a requisition and have a PO issued to be able to pay for it, while our cap within the system for not getting quotes is $10,000. So what we did here is provide a tier where bookkeepers and administrative support still maintain that $2,500, but principals, directors, and above would have a $5,000 purchase threshold, so they could make one single transaction in the amount of $5,000 or less. And then staff and procurement that have cards have those cards to aid schools in making purchases where it's a little bit larger than what we'd want a location to be able to handle in and of themselves, but it's worthy for a P card. And so if somebody had a $7,500 or $9,000 purchase that didn't need to go through a formal requisition process, they could ask a member of procurement, their liaison, to put that transaction on the procurement officer's P card to handle that for them, and then we would charge it to the appropriate general ledger account. We also have vendor cards. And so some of our largest vendors use a P card to charge the services to CCSD as they're consumed. And so that doesn't have a transaction limit because it's typically the aggregate of their monthly. And there's a very small subset of those that exist. So that's just listing by authority and by group what those would be. The next piece is roles and responsibilities of approving officials. Right now, the approval process is literally a piece of paper from Bank of America that says cardholder signature and manager signature. And we get a statement that has 2 signatures on it. That's processed. With the new system, there's going to be an approval workflow where there's an assigned supervisor in the system to each cardholder. And so in the case of myself, that would be Ms. Huggins. In the case of a principal, that would be their executive director or their associate. And so we just put together a brief overview of what level of authority exists for each position to ensure that they understand when setting up the system what the responsibilities are. So for example, you couldn't have a school level teacher have a data clerk approving their P card just based on the authority that exists. Anybody at the school level, the principal would have to sign off on that to say that the transaction was appropriate and worthy of being charged to that location's budget. Next change is a P card deadlines calendar. A lot of what we have issues with right now is just maintaining a monthly payment process. When statements are processed, payments are made on the card, keeping the balance down, and then getting all the paperwork filed. With the new system, it won't be a statement approval. It'll be per individual transaction. So if I go swipe my card on travel for a hotel purchase, that individual transaction will show up in my supervisor's workflow to say, yes, I approve that. And so essentially, as long as all those transactions are approved by each monthly deadline when the transaction occurs, then that entire statement will just automatically process based on that attestation. And it also does some auto coding and things like that. So it'll be much more automated than it currently is. That'll also help us with paying our sales tax to DOR because we can't make those payments properly until we understand all of the purchase that has been made, when sales tax was included or excluded, and make that computation. So that'll help accounting be timely and considerate of when they make those transfers to DOR. Next thing is our monthly credit limit profiles. So right now, there are credit limits all over the place, just to be totally transparent. Somebody might have come in and said, I request $10,000 on their application, and supervisor didn't, protest that. And so they got a $10,000 credit limit. Do they need a $10,000 credit limit? As an example, we went through and recently looked at cards. We had 92 cards that hadn't been used over a year with an aggregate credit limit of $2.4 million a month. We canceled them all. Looking at the need for a card, the association of the need to the responsible amount of limit they should have on a monthly basis. So we've assigned these cardholder profiles, and each person will have to be fit into a profile. It won't just be arbitrary. So your lowest level, at a school would be 3,500. Somebody that's intermediate going into like a bookkeeper role would be 5,000 unless there's a dictated need for them to be some type of a super user. It gets into advanced like a principal or an executive like an executive director or an associate. And then there's going to be a designated departmental assignee for somebody like administrative support that may make high value transactions or purchases for like our largest schools, for example, that would have one card per location with a high value limit. And then procurement, the officer that I mentioned, would have the highest limit because they make transactions for users throughout the whole system on a monthly basis. And then again, the vendor card holders have an unlimited profile, which we just sign off on a monthly basis based on the services that are consumed within the budget. We've added a provision for travel purchases. This is to try to make things easier on users. Right now, you cannot purchase food while on travel on your P card at all. And so what this does is allows a user of a P card to purchase group meals when on travel. Because we see a lot of schools take 15 people to an event and they like to eat as a group and socialize together, and they go to one restaurant. And as it stands now, each of those 15 people has to submit a per diem sheet to get reimbursed for what they might have expended on that meal. This would allow that one person to purchase that group meal on the P card, one transaction, no more per diem filings or anything like that. The group eats together. The employee doesn't have to carry the cost of the meal on their personal accounting for any period of time until they get reimbursed. And it should just make things easier for folks when they go on group events. We've also updated all of the forms and made them all fillable so that people can fill them out digitally versus on paper. And all of that's been uploaded to the CCSD intranet.
Okay, let's see if
Perfect. Do we have any questions?
Just for my layman world, the contracted vendor cards, it's unlimited because that's like, let's say it's Cummings, they're making a draw off of their monies. That's why it's unlimited, basically.
So, Mike.
So they're primarily vendor cards like contractual services, custodial services, all of the various vendors that we use like Bid Group, ABM to provide services and a way to get a rebate for the card. So only that vendor card is established in that vendor's name, and that card can only be used for that vendor. So based on the type, the size of the contract and the service, it might be $1 million card, it might be a $200,000 card. The cards are held by facilities maintenance, and they are reviewed each month. All the charges are matched up to invoices and to the statement and signed off on by facilities maintenance to ensure that all the work is done, all the invoices match the charges on the cards.
Got it.
I think Bud and ABM are probably our two biggest vendor cards that we see transaction volume through. And that just helps. I mean, the rebate that we get from the P card is several $100,000 a year. And so just, instead of paying cash by putting on the card, get the rebate back. And it also makes it a little bit easier for them to just process things in a more fluid manner.
And what do we use for our rebates? That money goes where?
So that money goes into the miscellaneous donations fund, and it supports children in crisis and a few other small programs throughout the system on an annual basis. I think it's about $400,000 a year. And our contract with Wells Fargo, prospectively, and Bank of America currently sets a point basis scale. So as our volume increases, the amount of the rebate increases as well.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you for that. And as you know, we've been waiting for that for a long time, so I'm glad it's done. Thank you. So let's move on to the budget milestones calendar.
All right, so this is FY26 at a glance. We also have a very detailed page version of this at the staff level that details every single meeting as we go through the budget process. So this really starts out, October, November timeframe, looking at staff allocation reviews and updates, school data reviews and recommendations. We're having a convened committee of principals and other stakeholders coming up to look at our standard allocations throughout the system to determine recommendations going into the budget process for next year. The first time this will really be seen is when our audit comes before Audit and Finance Committee on December 3rd, as we were talking about earlier. And then as we get into the new year, we'll start to see in January some of our early revenue projection summaries. Different this year, what I'm proposing to do is to have meetings with every single revenue generating department on a one-on-one basis. So if that department has a revenue tied to its operations, whether it's employee childcare or some other component of guaranteed revenue based on a service that they deliver, or even federal funds, we'll sit down and go through the projections for the year so that we have a very detailed understanding of what we're budgeting for each individual source. My office, of course, is responsible for projecting property taxes and other types of revenues that make up the most significant components of our general operating fund. But that certainly doesn't account for all of our special revenue funds and some of those other ancillaries within the GOF. So we'll have those meetings between the 8th and 13th of January. And then the other piece of this is we're going to have individual meetings with each central office location to go over their budget requests, so their expansion requests, as well as their target reallocations. So we haven't done this before because people typically get their prior year budget plus expansions. And what we're going to start doing is looking at history of expenditure of funds, and if there's savings that exist historically in a line, reallocating those to another line before we consider adding additional to the budget to support an expansion. So it may be that an expansion could be afforded with existing capacity the department doesn't know that they've had in one line versus another. So we'll sit down with all of our central office locations, and hopefully between that and our standard allocation review process, we'll have a good opportunity to look across the entire system and be thoughtful about those components. And so this really then comes back to the board at Audit and Finance in February. We'll do a very deep dive on our multi-year budget, and we'll have our new financial analysis model with all the sensitivity analysis tools and everything that we've been talking about available to demonstrate And then we'll move forward with our committee workshops between April, May, and June, giving profiles of a balanced budget prior to first reading, at first reading, and before second reading, before board approval.
Great, this is really good. Any questions? No. I'm glad we have the dates down. That's something we've been working on for a few years, getting dates down so we can actually know when things are coming forward. But that's this is perfect. I appreciate it. And questions, we'll move on to 6A. The next meeting of the Audit and Finance meeting will be December 3rd, 2024 at 2:00. All right. Hearing nothing further, do we have a motion to adjourn?